Hello, I'm Layla, and welcome back to yet another episode of Caesar. In today's episode, I want to continue the riveting story of Julius Caesar. I just felt like the last two episodes didn't do him enough justice in terms of his background and life under his rule, so in the next few episodes, we'll be discussing the life of Julius Caesar and the reality of life as an average citizen in Rome under the Senate and how their lives changed when Caesar eventually seized power. I feel like we don't talk enough about the actual lives of the people under the dictatorships. And I really want to set a better scene for you guys about life under a dictatorship. So without further ado, let's get into a deep dive about the much revered ruler, Julius Caesar. Okay, so before Caesar became, Caesar, he was born into a long line of Roman aristocrats in 100 BCE. And honestly, this is a bit of a side tangent, but I did not know that the BCs were counted backwards. Like, I know it's before Christ, but I didn't know it was counting up to the year 1. So that's just an interesting thing. So Caesar's family, they couldn't exactly be considered the richest amongst the elite, but their political connections allowed them to maintain their prestige over the years. Like most children his age, the only real responsibility he had was to learn, but unlike most children of his time, Julius received more advanced lessons focused on rhetoric, Greek language, literature, and proper speaking skills to prepare for a political career. It really wasn't like there was much else he could do, considering how much of a person's life at the time was determined by their place in the Roman hierarchy. Slaves were at the bottom, and then there was freemen, which were freed slaves, then plebeians who that's a funny thing to say, but the plebeians, they were basically just like your regular civilians, and occasionally they held military jobs. And finally, there were the patricians, my bad, which were composed of the nation's ruling class. That's what the aristocrats were, and that's where Caesar naturally fell into. And for a while, Caesar settled into his predetermined role without complaint. But after some time, you could say his ideas on the government became more radicalized. But why is that? Caesar thought the government was way too demanding and controlling as he got older. Now an adult, Caesar's gained many political connections, which allowed him to rise up in military ranks. He went on to do military campaigns in places like Gaul. We'll talk more about that, but a quick background: before he was a dictator of anything, Julius formed an alliance with Pompey the Great. And honestly, this is kind of funny. During my research, I thought it was like Pompeii the place, but Pompeii is like Pompey, like the guy. And Pompeii the place, like the volcano, I'm pretty sure it's Pompei. So that's just a little funny thing. But yeah, he formed an alliance with Pompey the Great as a way to protect one another from oppositions from the Roman Senate. And the official name of this alliance was the First Triumvirate. And yeah, I know what you're thinking. Tri means 3 people, right? Yeah, there was a third guy named Marcus Crassus, but I don't really want to focus on him because it's not like he's not important, because there were some things between the three, like Crassus and Pompey. They kind of had earlier disagreements because they both wanted to be consuls, and we're going to talk more about what a consul is later, but they both wanted to do it, and Caesar was just compromise and do it together. Which, it's a dual role anyway, so they could do it together. They just kind of didn't want to at first. Anyway, continuing on, I think it's more important to focus on the relationship between Pompey and Caesar because it's pivotal to what I'm about to reveal. In this relationship, Caesar married off his daughter Julius to Pompey, which strengthened their alliance, and it was actually going quite well for the two, and in turn for marrying off his daughter Julia to Pompey. Pompey kind of acted as the liaison between Julius's military campaign in Gaul. So he was able to do his military stuff in Gaul and do his conquest of Gaul because of his connection to Pompey. So, one second. Okay, so basically everything was going good in their alliance, except for the fact that After his conquest of Pompeii, not conquest of Pompeii, his conquest of Gaul, Caesar's conquest of Gaul, Pompey was not very happy or pleased with the way that Caesar went about it. He thought of it as really aggressive way of like campaigning, and so he couldn't really end the alliance because everybody was still alive. But unfortunately, Caesar's daughter, which is Pompey's wife Julia, she died of childbirth complications in 54 BC, and Crassus died 1 year earlier in 53 BC of like a war tragedy. So now there's nobody supporting the alliance between these two. So they quickly formed a rivalry. And prompted by Pompey and backed by conservative factions who already despised Caesar's rebellious nature against the government, the Roman Senate moved to strip Caesar of his military command in 50 to 49 BC, around that area. I think this was like when I mentioned in previous episodes about them saying, hey, you have to just come back as a civilian. You can't be a military leader anymore. We're not going to defend you. So this action was just a direct catalyst for Caesar's decision to cross the Rubicon River and begin a civil war, as mentioned in the previous episodes. Now that multiple Roman and Greek nations are in full-blown chaos, Caesar is faced with some pretty scary realities. One really big one is that his 10-year governorship is reaching its close, which means he's left with the question of what he will do once he's no longer protected from potential prosecution. They can really get him now. He needed to ensure his immunity, and the only way to do that in a time like this, when everyone is betting against him, is to capitalize on the popularity he's won from his success in Gaul to win the upcoming annual consulship. And I think now's a good time to tell you what a consul is. So a Roman consul, or just a consul in general, was the highest elected political and military office of the Roman Republic, kind of like the president and vice president. Two consuls were elected annually to serve a 1-year term, exercising supreme executive power in both military and civilian roles, holding veto power over each other to prevent tyranny. So you can kind of think of it as like the government is comprised of like you know how we have like the Senate, House of Representatives. So for them, they just had the Senate, and then they kind of had like their president and their vice president. But between the president and vice president, they kind of had like a checks and balances system going on. But you're gonna just remember that it's only for 1 year, and they have the ability to exercise executive power. This is gonna be really important in a minute. Because what Caesar does once he's in power is honestly pretty crazy. But let's back up a little bit. We're still in the Civil War. So, following 3 years of the brutal war Caesar evoked, he returns to Rome in 46 BC, victorious, of course. But Rome has sunken into poverty, food shortages, and civilian unrest when he returns. Caesar sees himself as the right man to tackle Rome's crisis, but in order to do so, he needs to persuade the Senate to support his cause. Caesar's adversaries in government still kind of think of him as a tyrant because, I mean, the man started a civil war. I'd probably think of him as a tyrant too. But yeah, based on his campaigns and unrelenting spirit, they did not trust him. So Caesar turned to Marcus Junius Brutus, a young politician who was the descendant of the Roman Republic's founder. Caesar and Brutus became close friends, and by the fall of 46 BC, the Senate was on board for most of its plans. Instead of arguing to keep the Senate at the ultimate, like, top of authority, well, at least during this time, because he's like, okay, y'all are already kind of failing your jobs right now. So he argues that he should be given the role of dictator, and promises it would only be a temporary 6-month trial in government, utilized only during an extreme circumstance like now, because they're pretty much in like the worst place they could be right now. But you know, that's just not going to work, because a dictator asking to be a dictator for like just a few months, I don't think they would do that. So, this position of dictator pretty much just contrasts with everything that their government is built on. They're built on a dual system of ruling where two people are in power. and are elected by the people, and he's basically coming in and saying, yeah, just put me in office. I'm cool with that. Just put me in office. I'm good. And it's not even elected by anyone so far. And I'm not even gonna lie, the Roman Republic, they bought it. Yeah, they saw it as necessary during the crisis, so they're like, yeah, you know what? Why not? We're gonna give this a try. But as expected, all of that power goes to his head pretty quickly. Caesar begins just straight up disrespecting the Senate. He doesn't stand to shake their hands during like professional events, and he no longer sees them as equals, and it's pretty clear to everyone. He doesn't even have to say it, he just doesn't do the things that show that he respects them. He's starting to become like a true dictator, a tyrant, and after a while, he just appoints himself dictator for life. So you remember when I said you can only just have a consulship for like 1 year? He extended it to 10. And then he said, I'm just gonna be a dictator forever, guys. Which is, biologically impossible, but I kind of see where he was going with it. It was probably kind of like a just keep passing it down to like through my lineage. So at this point, everyone, including Brutus, is just fed up with this guy. They're starting to see that they don't want him in power anymore, which I mean, duh, obviously. Why would you want someone in power who's going to be in power forever? Um, but we'll get more into that in the next episode because I know this one's kind of a long one compared to what I usually post. But until then, I'm Layla, and you've been listening to episode 12 of Cesar.